Well, as we saw in the Brown decision, Brown versus Board of Education, the court ruled that segregation by race in public schooling is unconstitutional, K through 12, and this directly overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. And in a subsequent case the following year, they issued an order saying that schools must desegregate with all deliberate speed. Now, that didn't end de facto segregation, which means that whites and blacks separate for reasons of economic, social, personal choice reasons. And there have been attempts by social engineers or judges or public officials to overcome de facto segregation and force people to integrate by redrawing school district lines, reassigning pupils to certain schools using programs like busing. Like we saw in the last lecture, that would be transporting students by bus outside their physical boundaries to another neighborhood to achieve racially desegregated schools. Um, it it's had a mixed result, um, and by the late 20th century, the courts began to really back away, and by the beginning of this century, they've struck down plans to do that. So desegregation, that means that you're not allowed to segregate or discriminate by law, by state statute, by local school district, and there have been efforts to integrate. That means trying to force people by government rule, by government law, by government issued court order to have groups of individuals or different groups combine in certain settings like public schools. But this is met with resistance. Now, the civil rights movement was in conjunction with the Brown case, and in the late 50s, boycotts, that means that people would not ride public transportation or not shop at a particular store, began. And these acts of civil disobedience, which is not protected by the First, Second, Third, Fourth, Fifth Amendments, just simply happen. The deliberate, non cooperative public refusals to obey laws considered unjust began in earnest in the 1950s with Rosa Parks and the Montgomery Montgomery bus boycott. This began the civil rights movement, and leaders such as Martin Luther King, a pastor at a local church, began to organize marches with his Southern Christian Leadership Conference and other groups also, CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, Student for Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Urban League. These all try to secure equal rights for African Americans, equal access. So nonviolence began to be a common tactic of the civil rights movement throughout the country. So activists would be trained to use nonviolence, how to use non threatening body language, how to go limp when dragged or assaulted. And in sit ins in the early 60s, people would sit at lunch counters that were segregated. And oftentimes, a store would just change their policies rather than face these kinds of incidents. They didn't want these things to get out there in the public where people would look and see, and it would anger the public. And all of these kinds of events did lead to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this was the huge act signed by Johnson that really changed a lot. Let's take a look at that. Here he is signing the law.
Let us lay aside irrelevant differences and make our nation whole, let us hasten that day when our unmeasured strength and our unbounded spirit will be free to do the great works ordained for this nation by the just and wise God, who is the Father of us all. Thank you and good night.
Here he would be signing just portions of a signature so that he could hand out a pen to each of the political leaders. There's Vice President Hubert Humphrey next to him. So he'd hand it to the Speaker of the House, Majority Leader, the Minority Leader of each of the parties. But this act outlawed discrimination in public places, accommodations, hotels, restaurants, movie theaters, public transportation. And federal money, because of the expansion of federal programs under beginning with the New Deal, but really expanding under Johnson's Great Society, these monies could be withheld from federal state government projects, public schools, if they practiced any form of discrimination. And it banned discrimination in employment, outlawed arbitrary discrimination in voter registration, and it authorized federal government to sue to desegregate public schools and facilities. So this would be a powerful tool in the federal government. There's Martin Luther King, who attended the ceremony.
Hello, Edgar. Glad to see you, man. You deserve several. Hello, Philip. Glad to see you.
Now, this is J. Edgar Hoover right here. He was the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Have you Will you see that the others, I want to talk to them when this is over with?
So this was a red letter event. Now, a few later, there was something passed called the Voting Act, then the Housing Act in 1968. This prohibited discrimination in housing, and the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development uh, developed guidelines. And if you discriminated against people that you were selling your house to, you could be fined, you could be punished. If you were renting and refused to rent, you could be fined, you could be punished. And people were made aware of this through what they call public service announcements like this one.
Hello. Yes. Can I ask a few questions about the apartment on Park Street?
What was your name?
My name is Juan Hernandez.
It's been rented.
Who is gone? Hello. My name is Sanjay Kumar. I am calling about the apartment on Park Street.
It's not available.
Not available?
Hello, my name is Tyrone Washington. I'm calling about the apartment on Park Street.
It's been rented.
Hello. I am Chen Lin. My name is Khalid Ali. I'm Tuan Bo.
Hello, my name is Moshe Goldberg. I use a wheelchair.
It's gone. Not available. All right. Thank you.
Yes, hello, my name is Graham Wellington. I'm calling about the apartment for rent on Park Street. Is that still available?
Yes, it is.
What is?
Yes.
Really? Housing discrimination is illegal. If you think you've been a victim because of your race, color, national origin, sex, religion, disability, or family status, call us. Fair housing. It's not an option. It's the law.
So you can see that they give you a phone number or a website. This was an advertisement produced by the Department of Housing and Urban Development and placed on television just to inform the public and to inform those who own property that you can't discriminate against people based on those considerations, those immutable characteristics. Now, there were those in the society that did not accept these gifts by the government. They rejected these things, and they rejected the goals of integration and racial equality. They simply wanted separatism and Black pride. And these were the Black Power movement people, which is still around in various forms, like the BLM, the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a group that uses sometimes violent tactics and really rejects goals of integration and calls for Black separatism. Malcolm X was an early leader of this group. Now, beginning in the 60s, there were events that led to riots and burning of cities, and events like the Vietnam War, and political events like Watergate and inflation and these kinds of things that kind of diverted attention. So civil rights has been on the back burner ever since for African Americans. And in 2008, of course, Obama became the first African American president of the United States. And we've had other high profile African Americans, including Colin Powell, head of the Joint Chiefs, and Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State. And right now, there are more than 10,000 African Americans that serve in elective office in the United States. 47 African Americans are now members of Congress. Now, in 2013, there was a recognition that the Voting Rights Act is antiquated, and it was in part declared unconstitutional. This section 4 that's talked about in your text was a section that defined the state and local governments that were subject, but the data was now 50 years old, and it was felt that by a majority of the court that the current law has outpaced, or it's not kept up with the current times. So a law based on events that are far in the past, when most are dead now, is unacceptable. Now, Congress could pass a new Section 4, but they haven't done it. The Department of Justice can still challenge electoral procedural changes, and people can do that too. But states, local governments no longer have to go to the federal government and get permission before they change things like add a voter ID law. Now, African Americans face continuing challenges related to law enforcement. That constantly comes up. Are they disproportionately victimized by crime? Well, yes and no. It is because they're victimized by their own fellow people of that particular race. And most African Americans who serve in prison are there because they've committed acts of crime. There is an education gap. African American students in high school read and do math at the level of whites in junior high school. So that is a gap. Now, there are other problems identified by people that we should take a look at. Let's take a look at what the top 5 issues facing Black Americans are.
What are the 5 biggest issues facing Blacks in America? Here's my list. Problem number 5, the victim mentality. Nothing holds someone back more than seeing himself as a victim. Why? Because the victim is not responsible for his situation. Everything is someone else's fault, and the victim sees little chance of improving his life. How can he get ahead if someone is holding him back? All this makes the victim unhappy, frustrated, and angry. This is how too many Blacks see themselves, as victims. So much so that their victim status becomes their primary identity and their ruling ideology. I call it victimology. Unfortunately, many Black churches preach this victimology. Many Black parents pass it on to their children. Inner city schools teach it to their students, and the Black media reinforce it. Meanwhile, the NAACP and other Black grievance groups fundraise on it. Problem number 4, lack of diversity. Blacks repeatedly demand an honest dialogue or debate about race. But how can there ever be an honest dialogue about race between Blacks and whites when there is virtually no honest dialogue between Blacks and Blacks? It's hypocritical. And if a Black doesn't think whites are ultimately responsible for Black people's problems, they're labeled a sellout, Uncle Tom, or race traitor. As long as this type of groupthink exists, race reverence of the Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson type will continue to be celebrated, while independent Black thinkers such as Professors Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams will be shunned. The honest race dialogue and debate that first has to happen is not between Blacks and whites, but between Blacks and Blacks. We demand diversity from others, but need to practice it ourselves where it really matters, in thought, opinion, and even political affiliation. Problem number 3, urban terrorism. As just about everyone knows, but too few talk about publicly, in majority Black cities, violent Black on Black crime is rampant. A Department of Justice study from 1980 through 2008 revealed that Blacks accounted for almost half of the nation's homicide victims, 47.4%, and more than half of the offenders, 52.4%, all while being 13% of America's population. The Tuskegee Institute conducted a study of all known lynchings of Blacks that occurred between 1882 through 1968. During this 86-year span, which is essentially the post-Civil War era up to the Civil Rights era, 3,446 Blacks were reportedly lynched. Presently, Black on Black murder eclipses the number of Blacks lynched over the course of 80 years, roughly every 6 months. Unbelievably, the culpability for this disproportionate amount of mayhem actually lies with the menacing 2 to 3% minority within the Black populace. I call them urban terrorists. And since they're literally spawned from problem number 2, the Black community protects them. Problem number 2, proliferation of baby mamas. The disintegration of the nuclear family has led to an astronomical increase of single mother households. According to the Moynihan Report, in 1965, nearly 25% of Black children were born to unwed mothers. The report's author, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, said this was a disaster in the making. He was, of course, vilified by so-called Black leaders and their progressive allies. But he was right. Today, the out of wedlock birth rate is nearly 75% and even higher in some urban areas. To be clear, baby daddies share this responsibility with baby mamas. Yet, while baby daddies are blamed and rarely shown compassion, baby mamas are rarely blamed and receive both compassion and support. This lopsided dynamic and the previously listed pathologies stem directly from the number one problem facing the Black community. Problem number one, unquestioning allegiance to so-called progressive policies. Unwavering loyalty to progressive liberal policies is the primary reason these dire conditions persist. It both makes them possible and perpetuates them. It's no coincidence that progressivism is the common thread that binds predominantly Black cities where single-parent homes, failing schools, rampant poverty, and crime predominate. Look at cities like Detroit, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. They've been run by progressive Democrats for decades. If their liberal policies were at all effective, these cities should have become models of economic growth and prosperity. Instead, they're models of dysfunction. By fostering and exploiting the victim mentality, discouraging self-examination, subsidizing baby mamas, and making excuses for Black thugs, so-called progressive policies don't alleviate the problems that afflict the Black community, they aggravate those problems. You may have noticed that racism did not make the list. Why not? It's simple. There will be no solution to the problems afflicting Black America until more Blacks recognize that the issues plaguing our community are ultimately self-inflicted. Does racism exist? Sure, but there are other problems far more serious. And waiting until there are no more races will mean waiting and making excuses forever. I'm Talib Starks for Prager University.
So that's his take on the continuing challenges of African American. That's just food for thought. Now let's go over the political and economic achievements of women in this country over time and some of the obstacles that women continue to face. Beginning in the 1840s, we had a movement of women led by people like Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, very famous lady that was on a coin for a while. One of our, I believe it was the $1 coin. Anyway, they organized the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York, and 300 people attended it and approved a declaration of sentiments. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women are created equal. So in the following years, they held conventions in various cities in the Midwest and East. With the outbreak of the Civil War, though, they devoted their women and their supporters in political realm, they devoted their energies to the war effort. Now, after the Civil War, though, they began to organize into two groups, the Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage. Now, the first one, the National Women's Suffrage Association, organized by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Oh, that was the lady on the coin, the Susan B. Anthony coin. They saw suffrage as only one step on the road towards greater social and political rights. The American Women's Suffrage Association, founded by Lucy Stone, they believed that the right to vote should be the only goal, but definitely the goal of the 19th and early 20th century was to give women the political right to vote. Many states in the West did vote. Here's votes for women walking over the West and pointing towards the East half of the country, saying, let's get it going over here. These poor people stuck in darkness. Here's a cartoon showing a woman pushing the woman's suffrage rock up a hill. In some countries, like in Great Britain, it achieved success a little bit earlier than in the United States. In the United States, you had, like it's shown in the previous cartoon, states in the West as early as 1869, and Wyoming had adopted women's suffrage. Some states admitted in the first year of statehood, like Arizona in 1912 adopted it. In fact, they weren't allowed to become a state until they removed it from the Constitution. They did for a few months, and then once they got statehood, they put it back in. Texas adopted it 2 years before the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. But some states held out till the 20th Amendment. These blue states here, some gave it just in the presidential elections, a couple to just presidential and municipal elections or local school elections, these reddish burgundy states. In Florida, suffrage was given in charter cities. So you can see by the early 20th century, most states had some type of voting by women even before the ratification of the 19th Amendment. But World War I hastened it. Women were involved in the military and that kind of thing. Now, after the success of the 19th Amendment, there was a lull in political efforts by women. Women were voting as much or more than men. And so during the 20s, 30s, 40s, and the 50s, women had pretty much achieved, for most women, what their goal was. But beginning in the post-World War II period, after women joined the workforce, there began a new movement called the feminist movement, and it gained speed alongside the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So let's go discuss that. Feminism traces its roots back to Hegel, the German philosopher of the 1770s through the 1800s. And he felt that it was the destiny of women to be just a supportive person in the life of a man. They would do all the work and the woman would be supportive. So the role was simply one of support. And this was a traditional role that had been women's role for thousands of years. Now, John Stuart Mill felt that he was an English philosopher from Great Britain who felt that the denial of women's right to vote was social despotism, that women should, at minimum, have some say in political events that do shape their own lives. So that was a 19th century view, and that caught on, of course, and would lead eventually to women getting the right to vote. Now, there are others like Jean Pateman, current feminist, who believes that the relationship between men and women is a sexual contract in which the male has all the power. Susan Oken, a New Zealand philosopher, writes that men and women are socialized in different ways, and the socialization overall leads to violence against women. She believes that the result is a differentiation of childcare. She believes that there should be shared childcare responsibilities and that there should be an extensive welfare state, similar to what we have in the Western nations, in Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand. But she would make it larger. All women would have access to government paid for, of course, taxpayer funded childcare, that kind of thing. All employers would have to provide for these things. Now, there are other viewpoints out there of what feminism is. This doctrine that advocates full political, economic, and social equality for women. Some, like Catherine McKinnon, they see that there are poor and there are rich standards of justice. She identifies the problem as kind of an ancient problem, really, that women are objects of men's desire and lusts, and that shows up, of course, in society's pornography. And she would, one of the solutions, she would say that pornography is not protected in any form, even between consenting adults. It should be totally outside the realm of protected free speech. Right now, it is regulated and can be tightly controlled, but I think she would have gone. Would recommend it going further than that, in order for women to gain full political, economic, and social equality. Uh, Feminists also like Jean Elshtain, um, they're of the view that you can't change the basic nature of men and women. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus, is a phrase used to describe the uh, the social, the physiological, psychological makeup of men and women is quite different. Using the Greek Roman gods of war and love, men are simply made to be the aggressive type because of their physiology, their testosterone. Whereas women, the caregivers, the nesters, because of their physiology, uh, their their hormonal structure, all the things that make women women, they're from Venus, so to speak. So men and women, they do speak differently, and the only way that we can build a society in which women do have better economic, social equality, political equality, is to recognize that, which would strengthen the family. And she also stresses the importance of parenting together between a man and a woman. You can see her viewpoint in the YouTube video if you are so inclined. Now, Nancy Harstock kind of encapsulates feminism as a Marxist class struggle. A lot of people in the BLM movement, females, would agree with her and feel that we should end private property. A lot of these Antifa's supporters and BLM supporters would agree with this. And they would agree that women should seize power. And that's why they hate Trump so much, is that they see him as a male chauvinist, definitely a man from Mars. So they would abolish property and remove gender differences. Men and women would wear the same clothing, that kind of thing. Now, Camille Paglia, another feminist, views things from a Nietzsche point of view. Nietzsche talks about, similar to Elshtain, that there is a yin and a yang. There's law and order. There's basically two gods. There's Apollo, the god of law, the god of order, and then there's the Dionysus, another one of these Greek gods of chaos and spontaneity. And she says that biology, similar to Elshtain, guides relationships. So the key for her is finding the perfect balance. So, feminism is not a monolithic. It is a diverse group that advocates full economic, social equality. But what that looks like is different for different groups of women, different groups of men, different individual men and women. Now, since the 1960s, we've seen more women hold cabinet posts, state posts. Women have tried to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed beginning in the 1970s, but it fell a few states short. And occasionally it is brought up in the Congress again, like by Nancy Pelosi, head of the House of Representatives right now. The abortion decision, Roe versus Wade, I think ended any serious attempt to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. And since that time, many legislatures have introduced a variety of abortion bans in the first quarter of 2019. Texas is one of them, Florida, Washington, Oregon. Uh, 1% of the U.S. House of Representatives was a woman in 1916, but since then, we've elected a woman as the minority leader. Nancy Pelosi is the current majority leader of the House of Representatives. She's the Speaker of the House. She has been since 2019. The youngest woman ever elected was Sandra Cortez recently in 2018. Omar and Tlaib are some of the first Muslim women elected to the U.S. Congress. And right now, about 22% of members in the House are women. 3 appointees to the Clinton-Bush-Obama administration served as Secretary of State, and we've had 4 women on the Supreme Court. And if the current nominee gets approved, that would be the 5th woman to serve on the Supreme Court. Now, women in the workplace have faced wage discrimination, which was dealt with in the Equal Pay Act in 1963. Women cannot be paid less if they're doing the same work. And the following year, Civil Rights Act of 64 prohibits employment discrimination based on gender. Now, in 2007, the Supreme Court ruled that employers could not be sued under Title VII if the decision to discriminate in pay was made more than 180 days before the claim was made. But a lady named Lilly Ledbetter, the plaintiff in the case, brought this to the attention of Congress, and in 2009, President Obama signed a law that negated the court's decision. So under the new law, the 180-day statute of limitation resets with each new discriminatory paycheck. Now, what is pay equity today like? There's a lot of talk about that. Is it 70 cents, 77? Is it 82 cents? Well, remember, this is just the average pay a man receives divided by the average or the total of pay of women versus the total pay of men. But it doesn't take into consideration all different types of factors. Research suggests that wage inequality is just concentrated in fields in which staff members are expected to put in very long hours. Finance, where long hours are expected, they may have an equal pay structure because women have childcare responsibilities, so it makes it hard for them to work more than 40 hours a week. Let me show you an analysis of this pay wage gap.
If for the same work, women only make 77 cents for every dollar a man makes, why don't businesses hire only women? Wages are the biggest expense for most businesses, so hiring only women would reduce costs by nearly a quarter, and that would go right to the bottom line. Don't businesses want to be profitable, or are they really just bad at math? Well, actually, it's the feminists, celebrities, and politicians spreading this wage gap myth who have the math problem. Here's why. The 77 cents on the dollar statistic is calculated by dividing the median earnings of all women working full-time by the median earnings of all men working full-time. In other words, if the average income of all men is, say, $40,000 a year, and the average annual income of all women is, say, $30,800, that would mean that women earn 77 cents for every dollar a man earns. 30,800 divided by 40,000 equals 0.77. But these calculations don't reveal a gender wage injustice because they don't take into account occupation, position, education, or hours worked per week. Even a study by the American Association of University Women, a feminist organization, shows that the actual wage gap shrinks to only 6.6 cents when you factor in different choices men and women make. And the key word here is choice. The small wage gap that does exist has nothing to do with paying women less, let alone with sexism. It has to do with differences in individual career choices that men and women make. In 2009, the U.S. Department of Labor released a paper that examined more than 50 peer-reviewed studies and concluded that the oft-cited 23-cent wage gap may be almost entirely the result of individual choices being made by both male and female workers. Well, let's look at some of those choices. Georgetown University compiled a list of the 5 best-paying college majors and the percentage of men and women majoring in those fields. Number 1 best-paying major, petroleum engineering, 87% male. Number 2, pharmaceutical sciences, 48% male. 3, mathematics and computer science, 67% male. 4, aerospace engineering, 88% male. 5, chemical engineering, 72% male. Notice that women outrepresent men in only one of the 5 top paying majors by only a few percentage points. Now consider the same study's list of the 5 worst paying college majors. Number 1, counseling and psychology, 74% female. 2, early childhood education, 97% female. 3, theology and religious vocations, 66% male. 4, human services and community organization, 81% female. And 5, social work, 88% female. Here, it's the women who lead in all but one category. Even within the same profession, men and women make different career choices that impact how much money they make. Take nursing, where male nurses, on the whole, earn 18% more than female nurses. The reason? Male nurses gravitate to the best paying nursing specialties, they work longer hours, and disproportionately find jobs in cities with the highest compensation. Now here's how one expert on nursing compensation, Professor Linda Aiken of the University of Pennsylvania, sums up the data. Career choices and educational differences explain most, if not all, the gender gap in nursing. The Department of Labor paper concluded that once these differences are accounted for across all professions, the unexplained wage gap is somewhere between 4.8 and 7%, almost identical to the 6.6 percentage gap found by the AAUW. But why is there any gap at all? No one knows for sure, as both the AAUW and the Labor Department concede. There are so many variables that drive wages that no single study can cover them all. Few wage gap studies control for variables such as dangerous work environment. Men are vastly overrepresented, for example, on oil rigs. And here's another variable. Men are more willing and able to work long hours without advance notice. According to Harvard economist Claudia Goldin, even if 2 lawyers have the same education, same specialty, and work the same number of hours, firms pay more to someone who is willing to always be on call and ready to be in the office when the firm needs them, as opposed to wanting a more regular schedule. This isn't sexism, it's just common sense, with more realistic categories and definitions. Whatever wage gap remains would certainly narrow to the point of vanishing. So it seems that business leaders aren't bad at math simply because they don't only hire women. Those who claim that for the same work, women earn 77 cents on the dollar compared to men, on the other hand, are not merely bad at math, but at telling the truth. I'm Christina Hoff Sommers of the American Enterprise Institute for Prager University.
Okay, so she makes the point about this pay equity and how there are many other factors. Long hours is a big one. Now, the glass ceiling, this is a phrase used to describe that even though we have an increasing number of women in business and professional jobs, relatively few are able to rise to the top of the career ladder in their firms. So they're held back, discriminated against, not allowed to go further by a so-called glass ceiling. So it's invisible. We can't really see it, but it exists. And they cite one statistic: 1/6 of top executive positions in America's largest corporations are held by women. I don't know if that doesn't necessarily convince me, but you take it for what it's worth. Let's take a look at what this lady seems to think.
Glass ceiling has been with us for a while and is a very popular metaphor still. So you'll read it in journalism in particular, but also in the social science literature, the metaphor used. I think that it is not a good metaphor. We certainly still have prejudice against women in leadership roles in various ways. So, you could say, well, glass ceiling is a metaphor for prejudice, but if you look at it in a more precise, more detailed way, at the notion of a glass ceiling, I think we can see how misleading it is. For one thing, it suggests that the barriers are way up there in the hierarchy, so that a woman would, of course, have a career in the same way as a man, but then she gets near the top. She thinks she's going to become executive vice president or maybe CEO, and then whoops, she finds out she can't. She didn't realize that before, according to this notion, but she hits her head on the glass ceiling. So that's profoundly misleading, because the challenges that women face in having successful careers are not just at the top. They are all the way along the career, from step 1 through step 2, step 3, all the way through the career. So the reason you have so few women at the top of some hierarchies, such as being a chief executive officer in the Fortune 500, is that there are few women at that level right before that. So women progressively drop out of the hierarchy. It isn't that the women are there in great numbers and then can't get to that upper level. It's a progressive dropout that occurs for many different reasons. So it is a rather odd metaphor, actually, in terms of not capturing the phenomenon. Idea. It isn't anybody systematically misleading them, but there is the idea that there is no prejudice and that they have equal opportunity. And they've lived a life through school and through college with equal opportunity, fairly much. So it seems that that's true, but then they don't look out and see, well, women aren't doing as well. Women are systematically not doing as well in their careers as men, dropping out more, not rising nearly as fast. And so I think that's not that salient to many young women because they're not in the career yet. And then they may think, well, that's a different generation. We have equal opportunity. And then they enter the labyrinth. Ask those women 10 years later, when their male colleagues very often have moved forward faster than they have, or perhaps they're at home raising children and may never get back to anything like a fast track career. And so then they have a very different set of ideas about it through experience. So the problem is to inform younger women in particular about the labyrinth so that they will approach it thoughtfully and not have regret later on, but yet not be discouraging. So it's kind of discouraging to tell young women, no, we don't have equal opportunity, and let me tell you why. But the labyrinth idea is meant to be in that middle range that, hey, you have challenges that your young men colleagues don't have, but it's a labyrinth, not a glass ceiling. So maybe if you figure it out and are very thoughtful about it and learn about the contours, of the labyrinth, you will reach the goals that you've set for yourself in your life. They're usually very smart. they have thought it through. I mean, there's accidental features of careers, of course, opportunities that happen to come to a person, but I think those women have been thoughtful about their careers, and they've made choices that were enabling in various ways. You know, one of the biggest challenges for women in terms of career is family, of course. That's the obvious. And that comes often relatively young when you have all your training, you have your MBA or your law degree or whatever, and then you're going out on a career just like your male colleagues. And then for many women, there are those decisions about marriage and childbearing, which can become, depending on how that's managed, can be quite disabling for the career, because they often involve moving off the fast track. Either some women would drop out, and then other women would want to go part-time, understandably, but then they're off the fast track. So you see women who are CEOs, occasionally they've dropped out and stayed home for a few years, but that's very rare. Usually they either have not had children, or if they do, they've just managed it in other ways. You know, perhaps they have one of those husbands who shares equally or whatever, or they've managed to, many women manage to have families and successful careers, but it's much more challenging often for women than men, because women ordinarily have more responsibility for child rearing. So that's a challenge that comes very early. Perhaps many women don't realize that in studies that have been done, that's, you know, not managing that well is very damaging to career. It's hard after dropping out to get back to a successful career. It shouldn't be. The on-ramp should be there, but often it's not. And then the part-time work, it should be good quality work, but that could result in promotion, but in fact, that's not the case. Ordinarily, it's dumbed down work compared to what you would have if you were in a full-time career. And ordinarily, there are limited, if any, promotion possibilities. So you're on that sidetrack. Well, maybe you can get back on again. But your male colleagues who didn't do that are way ahead. And there's this whole cohort of young, eager men and women coming along too. So that's just one of the turns in the labyrinth, is how the family responsibilities are managed by a couple.
Okay, she gives it some good thought about, you know, what are the challenges that are faced by women in the workplace. Now, sexual harassment, this is prohibited by Title VII. So unwanted physical contact, verbal conduct, or abuse of a sexual nature. There's two types. There's quid pro quo and hostile environment. A quid pro quo is this for that. You know, I'll give you this if you give me something in return. A hostile environment is you create a very hostile workplace, and people can sue for that. And this includes harassment by members of the same sex. Now, you've got to show that, you know, hey, I talked to my employer and my supervisor, and if they show that they exercise reasonable care in preventing such problems, they're okay. And employers, if they can show the employee failed to take advantage of any corrective opportunities provided by the employers. So you've got to, if you're going to seek damages, if you're going to claim you are a victim of sexual harassment, make sure that you take advantage of any things that the supervisor does or allows or offers. Now, the Title IX, you're familiar with it in terms of sports. That makes sure that sports are allowed on campus. So gender-based discrimination in schools that receive federal money is not allowed. So schools have to offer females sports programs, but it also prohibits sexual assault on campus. Now, it also that applies to college campuses, and much has been done since 2011 because of a so-called study done that says that there is a epidemic of sexual assault on campus. Let's take a look at this study. This 1 in 5 women are assaulted, and you can tell. You determine if this is the case.
Are American college campuses rape cultures? Are they dangerous places where sexual assaults against women are happening at an alarming rate? According to many gender activists, academics, and politicians, the answer is yes. Here's what the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden, said in 2014. We know the numbers. 1 in 5 of every one of those young women who is dropped off for that first day of school before they finish school will be assaulted in her college years. Let's take a closer look at the Vice President's claim. Rape is a horrific crime, and rapists are rightfully despised. We have strict laws against sexual assault that everyone wants to see enforced. But while rape is certainly a very serious problem, there is simply no evidence of a national campus rape epidemic, and there is certainly no evidence that sexual violence is a cultural norm in 21st century America. In fact, rates of rape in the US are very low, and they've been declining for decades. Why would it be any different on a college campus? Where then does the 1 in 5 rate that Vice President Biden cites come from? Well, it turns out it comes from a study conducted over the internet at 2 large universities, one in the Midwest and one in the South. The survey was anonymous, no one's claims were verified, and terms were not clearly defined. In round numbers, a total of 5,000 women participated. Based on their responses, the authors, not the participants, determined that 1,000 had been victims of some type of non-consensual or unwanted sexual contact. And voila. From one vaguely worded, unscientific survey, we suddenly arrive at a rape culture on college campuses. Tellingly, the study authors have since explicitly stated that it's inappropriate to use their survey to make that claim. Much more comprehensive data from the US Bureau of Justice Statistics, or BJS, estimates that about 1 in 52.6 college women will be victims of rape or sexual assault over the course of 4 years. That's far too many, but it's a long way from 1 in 5. The same BJS data also reveal that women in college are safer from rape than college-aged women who are not enrolled in college. But the truth doesn't serve the purposes of feminist activists or vote-seeking politicians. Lies work much better, and the 1 in 5 claim is tantamount to a lie. Here are just a few examples of what this lie has wrought. At Scripps College, Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator George Will was disinvited from giving a speech. The reason? He had dared to question the rape culture mantra in a column he wrote. At the all-women Wellesley College, students demanded that the administration remove a campus sculpture of a sleepwalking man wearing only underpants. Why? Well, because the image of a nearly naked male could trigger memories of sexual assault for victims. According to Harvard Law professor Jeannie Suk, students now ask teachers not to include questions about rape law on exams for fear that such disturbing questions might cause them to perform less well. And at Brown University, students were so traumatized by a debate on the subject of campus sexual assault that activists organized a safe room equipped with coloring books, Play-Doh, calming music, and a video of frolicking puppies. No less absurd are the attempts by colleges and legislators to cure this non-existent plague. In California and New York, students now have to live by so-called affirmative consent laws. The California law says that affirmative consent by all parties must be ongoing throughout a sexual activity, while the New York law says that silence or lack of resistance in and of itself does not demonstrate consent. Confused? Pity the poor college students who have to figure this out. If it wasn't so serious, it would be laughable. But it's not funny to a growing number of young men who find themselves accused of sexual assault, publicly shamed, and then brought before campus judicial panels that are guided by rape culture theory. In such proceedings, due process is an afterthought. It's guilty because accused. But here's the best way to prove that the 1 in 5 number is phony. Ask yourself this question. Would you send your daughter to a place for 4 years where there was a 20% chance she would be raped or sexually assaulted? Of course not. Good rarely, if ever, comes from lies. The 1 in 5 rape culture lie is no exception. I'm Caroline Kitchens of the American Enterprise Institute for Prager University.
Okay. So is that a myth? Is it a reality? I'll let you be the judge. Do few women report assaults to school authorities? Do those who do receive little help? Are victims penalized for making complaints? Well, the Obama administration felt necessary because of that study to crack down on the problem, the perceived problem in it. And by 2016, 300 colleges were investigated, and many were at risk of losing their federal funds unless they improve their procedures. Students are unwilling to accept policies or language today, as you saw in the video, they consider discriminatory that have to do with sexual harassment. So they criticize the language and they get upset with that, and they allege that to be discriminatory or hostile. And so that's led to reactions. Now, some have said that this is an attempt to police language. This is part of what we call political correctness. This is looked at in your book in the Join the Debate feature in this particular book here. Talked about on page 111. Now, since President Trump and Education Secretary Betty DeVos have come in, they've withdrawn some of these Obama guidelines. So to kind of wrap up, we went over integration and desegregation, the civil rights movement, the bus boycotts, the tactics of civil disobedience and sit-ins when you simply do not obey lawful orders. And we've seen examples of this with the BLM movement, where people are told you cannot protest here, and some of them end up being violent. Now, in this particular case, the sit-in civil disobedience led to laws passed by Congress like the Civil Rights Act of 64, but I don't think this is the case with all the BLM stuff. It's angering the public, and BLM and Antifa are losing support among the public. And the polls show that they're rapidly decreasing in their support. Now, some groups like the Black Power movement rejected the goals espoused by the Civil Rights movement. Now, in the last 50 years, we've seen African Americans become presidents and secretaries of state and so on. Relations with law enforcement still an issue, and education is still an issue, and other issues that I mentioned, like crime, victimology, through that video. Now, women, the initial struggle was for Voting Rights Act, for voting, the suffrage. And that was achieved in the United States throughout the country by 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. But many states, as you see on the map, had already adopted something even as early as 1869. Now, feminism is a different idea, really developed after the Second World War in various ways, but it overall advocates this overarching idea of full political, economic, and social equality for women. Different philosophers have viewed it differently, but that's the overarching viewpoint, such as Pateman, Okun, McKinnon, Elstein, and so forth. Women have achieved a lot of offices at the state and federal level, control over the issue of abortion, and many are in Congress, served in administrations as secretaries of state, on the courts, and have achieved wage equality since the 60s. Whether or not the wage gap is because of discrimination, you can be the judge on that one. And what is this glass ceiling? Is it a real barrier? Is it preventing women, or is there something else? Sexual harassment is outlawed under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. You cannot require something in exchange for something of a sexual nature, and you cannot have a hostile work environment. There are many remedies you can seek, and employers are held liable by the courts unless they show these two things. Title IX of the Education Amendments prohibits discrimination. Of course, sexual harassment is, and sexual assault has been prohibited for thousands of years, but it's also prohibited by the Education Amendments. Next, we'll get into other groups.